In this episode of Getting Rich Together, I sit down with Jenna Nicholas to talk about what it really means to breathe new life into our organizations and communities. We explore spirituality, investing, and business, and why the future isn't just a great wealth transfer, but a great wealth enlightenment. Women don't talk about money the way we should. Not honestly, not openly, and not with each other. But that's changing. I'm Syama Bunten, founder of Wealth Catalyst. And Getting Rich Together is where the conversation lives. Every week, a different woman, a different path, and a conversation that will change how you think about your own financial power. This community is growing and you belong in it. Please subscribe so you never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review so more women can find their way here. Now, let's get rich together. I am here today with the most fabulous Jenna Nicholas, a leading impact investor and innovator at the intersection of spirituality, investing, and business. I mean, 3 very sexy and very important words. We're also celebrating her recent book, Enlightened Bottom Line. And I'm so excited for us to have this conversation today, not just because eventually we're going to get into how we blend spirituality and business. And to be quite honest, that's how my husband and I met each other, is in that conversation. So excited for this, Jenna, but also to get to know this fabulous woman who has spent her career in building and advocating for the things that you've believed in. So welcome to the show. Welcome to Getting Rich Together. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Okay. So let's start from the beginning. Jenna, spirituality, business, were these topics on your mind and on your heart as a little girl? You know, take me back to a young girl, somewhere between the ages of 7, 12 years old. Where were you on this beautiful planet of ours? And what was money like around you?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So I grew up in London. I was raised by my mother and grandmother, and I was raised as part of the Baha'i community, where there's a lot of emphasis around the intersection of spirituality in our work and lives. So there's a concept around work as a form of worship and a lot around engaging in service projects. So I actually spent some time, I think when I first went when I was about 11 in Congo and in India. And so this idea of like, how do we engage in the world and being exposed to extremes of wealth and poverty was something that was part of my upbringing, and actually took part in a program from the ages of 11 to 14 called Transformation for Peace. And it was with young people from all around the world. And it was all about reflecting on our values and place in the world. And so conversations around money and the intersection with power and a lot of these themes, obviously in a very sort of basic child way, but we're engaged around in these conversations. And so definitely just I feel extreme privilege to have been exposed to some of these conversations from quite an early age.
Wow. I mean, what was the feeling like, if you could take us back to when you, let's say, went to the Congo? And I mean, you can never unknow anything in life, but certainly when you're young, you're picking up on these impressions and things and people. And, you know, what were some of the feelings or some of the things that you experienced that you feel like really stuck with you?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So there was this program that I did, Transformation for Peace. There was a family there that were from Congo, and they wanted to do something similar in Congo. And so I went and just spent a summer with them and sort of working on this project around Transformation for Peace. And it was in Kinshasa. And this was a time, and it's still extremely challenging there, but this was a time where there was a lot of deep challenges in the city and in the country. And one of the things that really struck me in meeting many of the other young people that were around my age, or some slightly younger and slightly older, was the joy and happiness with which they embraced the most basic daily activities. And it was in a pretty stark contrast to, I think, a lot of the context and environment that I was in London, where there was a lot more access to material comforts, and yet I think a lot of angst and uncertainty and sometimes even just straight unhappiness. And so that was something that really struck me early on, was like the vastly different sort of access to financial resources, and yet the sort of access to, I'd say, like spiritual resources, but like a deep inner sort of joy and happiness that came from a place that felt, very different than just, like, what is the next item that I'm going to be able to have? So that was something that definitely really struck me early on.
And when you found yourself moving through, middle school and then high school and doing your upper levels, like, how did you sort of experience yourself as this young teenager? Were these experiences kind of woven into how you treated yourself? For some reason, I get this very, very clear, like, vision of like Jenna being very serious, it's sort of like, like, okay, like I've seen more than I should have, or I know too much now. And how do I sort of embody this? And the impression I get is that you were a serious teenager, and I could be totally off base, but what was it like for you in high school, and how did you start to organize all of this?
Yeah, no, I think that's like the perfect word, is like when people sometimes say like, oh, you're so serious. I was like, if you think I'm serious as an adult, like you should have seen me at 12. Like I was even more serious as a kid, I think, than I am now. No, it was. I like, felt this like fervor, and I still do, but now I think I've embraced more of like joy and play. Ironically, like more as an adult. But as a kid, I came back from some of these things, and I particularly around things like climate change. Like I went to a school called St. Paul's, and I was involved with like the St. Paul's Environmental Action Committee, and it was speak, and we, like advocating and making sure everyone would turn off their lights and like recycle everything. And I was so passionate, right? And so, yes, definitely very, very serious kid.
And did you sort of think about, at that age in high school, where did you have any inclinations for like, and I'm going to start a business and it's going to be a social enterprise? Or, how did you kind of think about money as a young person? Like, do I need money to buy these jeans or to go out? Like, how did you sort of context money in relation to this young, fabulous, yet serious life you were living?
No, it's interesting. So I, as a young person, I really wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And actually, I think if anything, I saw the sort of the nonprofit, like the sort of struggle and the fundraising and the idea of that actually, if anything, that sort of that money causes problems, and that actually, like, how do we build from like, an impact being separate from money? And it was actually only in coming to the US and going to undergrad at Stanford and meeting some incredible social entrepreneurs. I remember my freshman year calling my mom back in London and being like, I want to be a social entrepreneur. And she's like, what is that? And I was like, I don't know, but that's what I want to do. And just being so like captivated by this idea of, I'd been exposed to so many of these nonprofits that were constantly struggling to fundraise. And the idea of seeing these models where there was built-in revenue producing models and some sustainability built in, and they were also having incredible social and environmental impact, it really have captivated me and became a through line through much of the rest of my journey.
I love that. And so as you also seem like someone who's like, okay, I got the goal. I'm going to go hit that goal. And then I'm going to like hit the 5 other goals that I didn't know that I'd secretly set up for myself. But then like, and then you hit them all, and then you're like, I'm on to the next thing. Did I nail you? Was that like?
Yeah. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. So high school, so university, and social entrepreneurship, which, I think it's such a beautiful and early concept back then, right? Like, what does it look like to do good and make money and sort of build? And there have been some great, companies and stuff that have started from there. It's been a tricky thing to navigate, I feel like. And overall, all companies should be social enterprises, because I feel like we just totally missed the point here about like labor and the dignity of work and, anyway, I don't want to get too far off the mark here. But, as you are sort of thinking about, launching yourself into the world, obviously when you're young and maybe you have the comforts of parents taking care of you and you have an altruistic vision in mind, it's like there's something that changes once you launch yourself out of university and you go, oh shit, I have to like pay rent. I have to operationalize, ideals and vision in a different way. How did you start to reconcile your ideologies and your directedness and this single, this direction in life to get certain things done, but then also with the truth of being a young woman who's launching herself out of university and needs to get a job? What did that look like?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and it's one that I think a lot about along the way, and feel and really privileged that during undergrad I had a chance to meet, and really two people in particular who have continued to be dear friends and collaborators. Wayne Silby, who started the Calvert Funds, and Elliot Donnelly, who was doing a lot of work in China. And we had a chance to collaborate initially on some projects in China. And both of them really opened up my world to this whole field of social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And I ended up, upon graduating, moving to DC and working with Wayne. And he literally had a basement apartment, and I lived in the basement apartment, and we would host these like work events and discussion groups and all sorts of things in the home. And I built this, what really started as more of a set of projects with him that were, some working with the Calvert Funds that had been really this pioneer in the area of social responsible investing that he had founded, and that sort of led to other opportunities with other foundations and family offices. So it really started very organically, and actually with a lot of, I'd say, uncertainty around, to your point about that sort of end goal. Like I had a lot of trust in the process, and a lot of it was just meeting one amazing person after the other and feeling such a sense of, how do I support and engage this person on the journey of life? And so that's been a really interesting balance, I think, along the way, is like both having those sort of North Star of where I'm seeking to go, and then also just trusting kind of the unfolding of the universe and the people that are presented in our lives too.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. And so, how long did you live in the basement?
Yeah.
and like, were you like,
make it out?
Yeah, were you like so excited to get your own place? And then, like, given that you had such a rich opportunity to engage in the world in this way, that really, it seems almost like you were deeply seen at a very young age. And but at the same time, again, when it comes back to like, okay, and I gotta go flip and pay for things. So like, did you negotiate a salary? How did you know you were getting paid well? Like what happened? Like what happened between like basement salons and then like, and then like the next thing?
Yeah, no, it was super interesting. And, it was really interesting coming out of undergrad, where I had, a number of friends that were going into consulting and banking, or they were pre-med, they had these like very defined pathways, and like this couldn't have been more different to that, right? And so there was very little in terms of the sort of benchmarking of, to your point about salaries, of like, well, this is what somebody should be making in this role, because like, what is this role? And so it was, a lot of that was like working it out along the way. And I ended up being in the basement for 3 years. So it was, it was quite a journey, and it was great. And I think part of it was, there's a number of people, there's sort of a legacy of people that have lived in this basement. So we talk about it as like, the PhD of the basement, right? Because like there was so much learning. Like it actually really did feel like going to graduate school, just like being in that environment and the exposure. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it was certainly, we started initially around a kind of hypothesis around, this is a payment. And then, as I mentioned, it was really structuring it as like different consulting projects. So it was cobbling together like this opportunity here and that opportunity there. And I think that also just taught me a lot experientially around budgeting and money, and was, to your point, of the independence of being in a new city and working out, well, like this is how much I need to eat, and so this is how much I need to make. So it was, kind of along the way. And again, feel just so grateful for the opportunity to be able to like learn those things and learn it. And I love your point about being seen, because I think that was a huge part of what enabled the creativity to even explore so many of these ideas, was both being seen in these work environments, and then of course the foundation of my mother and grandmother from childhood, I think also, and like them deeply seeing me and believing in this, like whatever it was that I was doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's so powerful. So that as you decided then, was it by the time after those 3 years, maybe it was sometime before then, was it you've tasted now so many different opportunities, and now was there any sort of like, was there anything that sort of caught you by the tail, where you're like, like, I think I want to go down this path a little bit more, right? Or I think I want to start building specifically in a direction. How did you sort of make your exit after those 3 years and sort of transition to the next thing?
There were a few things. So one of the projects that I had a chance to work on while I was living in DC was, and really again also an introduction from Wayne to the Wallace Global Fund, where he was serving on the investment committee, and they were building out a coalition of foundations to shift capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions, and really brought me in to lead this project, which was just a fascinating experience. At the age of, was then about 22, we ended up building this coalition of about 170 foundations, about $50 billion of assets under management, to shift capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions. And it was really around this piece, to this point about alignment of capital and values, of the observation that, for many foundations, they were doing incredible work with their grant making, but then their investments might be undercutting the work they were doing on the grant making side. So they're making grants to environmental organizations, and then their investments are investing in the fossil fuel industry. And so that was a really powerful project for me to be part of, in terms of just like learning more deeply about also like how do we go about achieving more of an alignment between our investments and our values, also seeing the disconnection so often between many of the investors that we were working with and the communities that they were looking at investing in. And so I went back to Stanford for business school, really with this idea of what would it look like to build more bridges between ourselves and our money, between investors and communities. And that was really the start of the impact experience, which is what I built after graduating from business school, and about 10 years ago now, to kind of really build bridges between people and their capital and the communities that have been overlooked and underestimated.
Wow. It's so funny, because the way you just described your life, you would have overlooked and missed like 30 other things that you did. It was almost like, and then I did this, and then it was this, and then the end. Or like, and then you dotted like 30 other things, and all the other ways in which you've been changing the world. Talk to me a little bit, post university and post your MBA, and sort of looking into building this business that you've been running now for over 10 years. Where were some of the financial inflection points for you? I think it's really interesting when we start to work with other people's capital, and then all of a sudden we are aligning and working with our own capital, and so there becomes this point where all of a sudden you're now able to sort of live up to your own values, and really sort of ensure that you're stewarding your capital in the most authentic ways. And I believe, for each person, it's different. I think some are really coming into that now, or coming into it later in life. For you, it sounds like maybe even the money you would make from your chores would probably have gone to the right places. But when did you sort of start to notice the inflection point in your own capital, where you were able to start to execute and make some really interesting decisions for yourself?
It's been a really interesting journey to that point, is that, so much of my work, and, now in addition to the facilitation work I do with Impact Experience, I also run a fund with Lightpost Capital, where, to your point, you're managing other people's money, and we're investing in socially responsible businesses and funds. And one of the things that was so interesting, and this really happened probably about a year coming out of undergrad, and has sort of continued to happen along the way, is that I've got so excited by companies that we're looking at potentially investing in. And sometimes for one reason or another, it may not be a fit for the fund that I'm working with. But I remember, and like one example of this is a company I had a chance to invest in called Asusu that does amazing work supporting people on the pathway towards home ownership. And they use credit score data, rental score data as part of the credit score assessment, and just amazing company. And I remember it wasn't going to work for the fund that I was working with at the time, but I was so excited by what they were doing that I was like, is there any chance that I might be able to just invest personally? And it was going to be a small check, but I remember it being like such a beautiful part of the interaction with Samir, the co-founder, and it's continued to be a dear, dear friend. And I think there was something, and since then there's been a number of conversations like that with different entrepreneurs where I've been able to have a chance to invest personally. And it's been, I think, one of the deepest like privileges of my life to be able to, like, just in a very small way, but contribute towards, you know, these incredible entrepreneurs' journey. And so I do think that the more that began to happen, the more, exactly to your point, it became less just, oh, this is this professional thing that I do, but rather like, this is also, how do I think about my own resources, and like, how much capital can I actually put towards these types of investments that are, you know, longer term, you know, higher risk investments, but I think where there can be, you know, incredible impact, and in many cases also great financial returns too. And so began to then also think about it across, you know, other assets. And to your point, it being, you know, how to really think about where that impact can be, you know, whether it's in public equities or even where cash is held, like everything has been that kind of through line through the decision-making process as well.
You know, I love that you mentioned some of these other ways to create impact with capital. I feel like often these days we hear about creating impact mostly like in fueling venture-backed startups. You know, we hear a lot about that as one channel. But the idea that you can invest in funds, you know, you can invest in other asset classes, you can bank differently, you can buy, you know, one of my favorites is the WCEO ETF, where, you know, you can invest in all these women CEOs. I mean, there are so many different ways that our capital can be put to use. Can you highlight for the audience and more for me also, like, how did you sort of come across these things? Like, how did you figure it out? Because I feel like there's also been, it's almost like you have to wayfind, you know, and it's like you have to dig and research. So what are some of the gems and jewels you have figured out, and how did you figure them out?
I think wayfinding is a great analogy, and that's exactly, you know, how it's felt. I think part of it has been like really setting the intention of wanting to do that and being open to asking the questions. And I know a lot of your work is around, you know, creating these spaces, particularly for women to engage and have these conversations. And that's been a big part of the journey for me, is to like really asking people and being open to asking questions that particularly is learning about different asset classes that may not have been part of the work that been engaged in, you know, asking questions that might sound stupid, but being okay doing that as part of the journey of lowering the barriers to entry for engaging in this work, and doing so in community. Like, I think a lot of what I feel really blessed over the years is to be in community with people where we're actively sharing different opportunities that we're looking at, and just as much as it is like as part of the learning journey. And it may be that, you know, half of the things that we look at, or more than half of the things, we won't end up investing in, but just going to pitches together, or being able to not take for granted that we've sort of got things set, but actually constantly looking at, so we talked about different aspects. Like, I've looked at like hedge funds that are doing work around carbon offsets, or affordable housing funds. And, you know, a lot of these things are like pretty unique structures, but actually like just enjoying the process of learning about how different people are, you know, navigating the financial system, and some of them may be this doesn't make sense for now, but knowing about it and then being able to think about it, maybe somewhere down the line this makes sense as part of an overall portfolio approach, and trying to enjoy the process, and like rather than seeing it as a like, oh, this is the chore that I have to do, of actually like, oh, what great people, and like just seeing the passion and energy that people bring into, you know, how they're approaching and engaging around some of these issues too.
A few years ago, I called 50 of my closest friends and asked them one question: how do you manage your own money? 95% of them wouldn't answer. It's the reason I built the Money Story Reset. 5 reflections on the beliefs shaping your relationship with money, and my own stories are in every single one. The parts I don't usually say out loud included. I didn't write this from the outside. I did every page myself first. It's free. The link is in the show notes, or go straight to wealthcatalyst.com/reset. That's wealthcatalyst.com/reset. I love it so much because at the end of the day, it's just flipping math, right? So it's like it's just math. And yet there are so many barriers, right, that have been created to sort of take out the to make it not as fun or easy or socializable. And so these opportunities to socialize these things and to make them feel more accessible, and then to be able to understand context. And, it's exactly sort of why I started this Wealth Catalyst community, because it's like, well, how can we have a space to understand something like creative ways that hedge funds are being executed, or even know if it's right for us without actually just being able to talk about it. And, I think that's so. Recently, we looked at something that was it was private credit with climate infrastructure. And it was just blew my mind. I was like, I had no idea. You could do something like this, which is it's so incredible. So as you sort of look at your financial life right now and sort of, what it is that the pie that you've sort of created today, and how often you think about the movement of the slices, and what does it look like? How fluid is your financial life for you? And how do you sort of think about your existing allocations? Is there an area that you feel really confident and secure about? Are there other areas where I want to develop this more? What does it feel like?
I love that question. It's something I really think about a lot. So I've really tried to this point about learning over the years, but really learn a lot about how different people have constructed their portfolios. And I love talking to different financial advisors and asking them all these questions from different angles around how, what their recommendations are, and based on people's ages and all of that. So I have I'd say a set of working hypotheses that I'm constantly iterating around. And so I feel at this point, pretty good in terms of having some a core base. I have some real estate assets, some of the more venture side, some of the more the public equity side. And so it feels pretty good in terms of across the board. And I think that I've been I have a donor advised fund, and I try to be really thoughtful in the same way around the investments, but also on the philanthropic side. Because I think that's also something when we're having these conversations, is that it can so often be I'm going to have all this rigor when it's applying to the investments, and then with philanthropy, I was well, that's nice, I'll just do that. And I actually think that there's something around in the same way that of making longer term strategic thinking around finances, also doing the same as it relates to philanthropy and around social investing. So I really try to sort of think about it holistically in that way. And there's obviously huge uncertainty in the market, and who knows what's going to happen next time we talk, right? And so I think that's always this piece of how to control the controllables, and then also at the end of the day know there's a lot that isn't controllable. And so I think that's part of, and I think that's part of this conversation around spirituality and business and investing, is also how do we be as intentional as we can be, and then also have an element of detachment of knowing we don't really know, right? And so how to be okay with that, and weather the sort of ups and downs of the navigation of that as well.
And also, I feel coming home to this, very early stage experiences for you, it's building within an infrastructure that is really a young infrastructure that is essentially a game, right? And knowing very deeply that happiness and life and enjoyment and family and all these things exist for all humans, and you experience that at a very young age, that the infrastructure that we're choosing to play in is a chosen infrastructure that's not really at the core of our humanness, right? And I think it's so interesting when I think about the systems. I was talking to my stepkids the other night, and I was telling them about how I was like, oh my God, the debt surpassed the GDP of the country. And our 11-year-old went, well, how did our president allow us to, become
yeah,
bankrupt?
that's the right question. Yeah.
And I was like, how interesting, because then I started explaining to him about, well, our financial systems and all these things are all big experiments that we've all implicitly provided trust into, right? But like to attach our identity and ourselves to these things, right, sort of leads us further astray from who we are. Right. And what is that sort of happiness? So dive more, let's sort of dive a little bit more into that inner work, that level of awareness that you've carried through your life that has certainly impacted the ways in which you've created and not just shaped businesses, but by virtue of the organizations and the people you've worked with, your personal efforts have reached like hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's like this sort of butterfly effect and the voices and rooms you've been able to shape and be a part of. And yet it comes back home to you and your purpose and your mission, right? So there's, Jenna, who's out here creating visible, massive change in the world. And then also your driving force of spirituality, morals, values, and how you want to see things. When you're talking to someone and sort of explaining who you are, and maybe this person is more traditionally rooted in finance, or in business, how do you inject this sense of self-responsibility, self-awareness, and spirituality into that conversation?
It's been a really interesting journey. So with the book that I just wrote, Enlightened Bottom Line, it was really based on a series of interviews with different investors and business leaders about exactly that question, right? Like how are they bringing their values into their work and their lives, how are they influencing the organizations that they're part of. And what really emerged in so many of these conversations is what I now call the HEAL framework, which is hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy. And there was one example in particular that I think about a lot in terms of your question, which is a company that I had a chance to invest in called Devoted Health. And they've done extremely well financially. They recently raised a round at a $13 billion valuation. And they're in the healthcare space. And they have this exercise that they encourage all of their healthcare providers to go through before they engage with any of their patients, which is to close their eyes and imagine that the patient they're about to interact with is a beloved family member. And it's such a simple exercise. And yet we think about, how often when we engage within the healthcare system, or for that matter, many of the systems we interact with, and how rare it is to actually, for people to engage from this place of imagining that we're part of the same beloved family, and like what can come about as a result of that. And so, and I think a lot when people are like, oh, well, does values have a place in business? And like, how do you go about integrating some of these pieces, is that it can sometimes be the simplest of exercises like that are just these reminders of like, who are we really, like independently of all of these conversations around wealth and status and power, like what is that core humanity of what connects us to one another, and our ability to see that humanity in another and what can come about as a result of that, I think is something that some of the businesses that I've seen that have been the most successful at really bringing values to the fore have practices like that really reinforce these values over time.
It's really important. My husband has a framework that he implements at his company called Leading with Love.
I love it. Exactly. Yeah.
And I've been trying to convince him to like take it on the road, but he's not that kind of guy, He's not that kind of guy. Take it on the road, But, as you're sort of looking a little bit deeper, the people who you interviewed, were there sort of like life experiences that they had? Or was there anything that sort of stood out as, these great leaders all shared? I don't know. I always find sometimes I hear people go, oh, you're an entrepreneur, you must have good childhood trauma, like there's always like a common thread that binds all overachievers. But, as you were sort of interviewing these leaders, did you find anything juicy or maybe, I don't know, unusual or something that sort of stood out that you weren't planning on?
It definitely was like this role of these transformational moments. Sometimes it was like the kind of the dark nights of the soul, of like deeply challenging experiences that forced people to confront their reality and their existence and why they're here in this world. And that being really a catalyst for then shaping what people would go on to do after. So there's a story that I often come back to, actually from Wayne Silby, whose basement I lived in, who started the Calvert Funds. When he first started the Calvert Funds in the late 70s, he had started it just as a money market fund, and they were doing very well financially. And he went to a Buddhist retreat, and at the retreat, they had them reflect on what it would say on your tombstone. And his reflection was, it would say, the man that made 2% more than the next man. Like, this isn't really the legacy that I want to leave. And so he went back to his colleagues to basically, we need to make this socially responsible. And it's now a $45 billion firm and really been a pioneer in the space. But it really came from this existential moment of reflecting on his tombstone and why is he here and what is he trying to do. And so I think in one way or another that type of question, or being forced to engage around that, was definitely a catalyst for many of the people I spoke with.
And as you're sort of thinking, how these lessons, integrate themselves, especially into your work today at Lightpost, how are you you can't not write a book like this and then not just be massively sort of swept up in your own individual, either new verbal articulations, right? Because sometimes it takes other people's words to be like, oh yeah, that thing. So either a change in language, but also a change in the way you're approaching things and doing things differently or thinking about them differently. What has sort of changed for you at this moment?
Yeah, it's been a really deep impact on me. And certainly with our work with Lightpost, it's really, I think, shaped so much of how we engage with the companies that we invest into, and also how we engage with our investors, and really having these deep conversations around how do many of these themes around hope and empathy and abundance and legacy show up within their work and lives, and what is the deepest calling for the entrepreneurs and investors that we work with, and really seeing the work at Lightpost as a living laboratory for the exploration of so many of these principles. And I mentioned about being part of the Baha'i community. There's a lot in the Baha'i community around the power of consultation, and that, no one of us have the answer, but rather what can come about when we're in spaces where we can be in deep inquiry together. And so I really see the investment work as a spiritual inquiry, right? And as a way of being able to engage in these questions collectively. And none of us have fully worked it out, but maybe there's pieces of the puzzle that we each see that through engaging together and engaging in a deep way together, we might be able to move some of these issues that bit forward.
I love that. And, from a more personal lens, so the clear sort of articulation around how this impacts your work, but then also like friendships, home life, family, again, like this sort of inquiry, which seems to me to be I could see this as Jenna age 10, like deep lines of questioning. Like this definitely, I feel like on your t-shirt, it could be like, likes to ask deep questions and think philosophically about the world and systems.
Yes.
But how, have the conversations at home with friends and family changed, as this book has sort of come to a completion and is now being birthed into the world?
100%. Well, one thing around the childhood also, I these discussion groups that still host at my home, but we started them when I was about 12 years old, and they were called Saturdays at Jen's. And we literally had a Facebook group, and people would just come and have these deep philosophical conversations. So yes, it's definitely been a through line. And I think part of that is that I've drawn these weird people around me, right? Like people that care about all this stuff, and we're weird together, So I think that there is something around that, you attract, you manifest what you are seeking. And so I feel unbelievably blessed that I have an incredible community of friends where we have these really deep conversations around how are we blending our values and our work and our money, and where we're seeing challenges around that. And But it definitely has been, I've noticed, particularly over these last few months since the book has come out, that it's deepened those conversations, both with the people that I've been friends with for a long time, but it's also brought new people into my life. That it's been also such a beautiful aspect of the last few months, is like people that have reached out or people I've met through book discussions and that are asking, you know, many of these questions. And so actually forming like new relationships from a starting point of engaging around these topics has been kind of new frontier that I'm really enjoying. And it's such a highlight of my life right now, actually, is being able to just engage in these, you know, deep conversations that are sparked by book talks, but that, you know, lead to all sorts of other forms of collaboration and exploration as well.
I love it. It's like you're the lighthouse now for something new, and you get to like both see out further now, but you also get to be the light that brings people in closer. You know, that's really beautiful. So obviously we know that like we're all going to be living just a bajillion years longer than we ever thought we would. And hopefully within our lifetimes, we will see a lot of systems change, my hope, and we will have been a big part of how these things evolve and how the world changes. But then also just tell me that there's probably about 3,000 more things that are going to be on your LinkedIn profile between now and let's say like, you know, 110. There's a lot more living and a lot more to do. What is your vision of the world, and how might we see this body of work that you've been, you know, curating and developing evolve over time? What do you see in your crystal ball?
A couple of elements that come to mind. One is, so a lot of our work has been really looking at the, you know, $82 trillion in the asset management industry, and the fact that less than 2% is invested into women and people of color run companies and funds. And, you know, how do we, both through our investments, but also through the facilitation and coaching and engagement work, help to unlock more capital, you know, into a broad array of different types of businesses and funds that have been overlooked and underestimated. And I think that the engagement around this, like, spirituality and business and investing is a component of that in terms of our own deepening on our pathway around this work. And so I think my vision around like what the world could look like is both that we have more capital that's allocated that represents the diversity of our communities in the world, and also that we normalize conversations like this around how are we bringing our values into our work and lives and integrating purpose and spirituality and however that may look for different people. I think a lot about, you know, the root of the word spiritual comes from spiritus, meaning breath. And so it's like, what does it mean to breathe new life into our organizations and communities, and that not just being this niche conversation that happens on the side, but is very much built into organizations, such to your point earlier, that we, you know, don't have to have the language of, you know, social entrepreneurship or spiritual entrepreneurship, but it's just entrepreneurship or just investing because it's, you know, so deeply embedded. So that's my hope.
Sign me up. I'm in. Yeah. I'm in, Jenna. I'm into it. Let's do it. Let's make the world, you know, let's make it happen. You know, we talked a lot in our conversation about some more serious things, right? Like different ways of looking at asset allocation, how we want to change the world with capital. What does it look like to invest with values? But we both know that money can be really fun, that there's a lot that it can do for you, and that there is some pleasure to be had with capital outside of investing, which I know is also pleasurable depending on how you're investing and who you're investing into. But tell me a little bit more about some of your most recent fabulous ways, my love, that you have been spending your money.
Well, one thing that first came to mind as you said that is probably now how it was probably from about the age of 15, 16. My mom made this investment, but it's investment in experiences, but investment in this basically like timeshare type situation of where each year, so this is now over the last 20 years or so, and my mum sadly has since passed on, but I've continued this tradition where each year in a different location around the world for about a week, we'll gather together a group of friends, and it's but just pure fun, and it's just engaging with we've been over the years to Morocco and Thailand and all sorts of different places around the world. And I think that's something that it's certainly, money provides the opportunity to be able to do something like that. And it's like truly one of the highlights of my year each year is just that ability to be able to spend quality time with people and just hiking and playing together, and of course having deep discussions too, because that is also joy. So it is all going to come back to that, but also just pure fun. So that's definitely something that when I think about one of the privileges of what like money has enabled, that's definitely very high on the list.
Is there any beer pong in Morocco?
Yeah. Some of the local equivalencies. Yeah.
Oh my God, Jenna, I love that. So obviously, you're spending your time and energy in furthering things in the world that are so important and require a lot of attention and thoughtfulness. But what I always like to find out, and I think this is so equally as important, is how can we, the audience, support you? What are you calling in right now? What do you need? What do you want more of? How can we share some more love on you?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think one thing is just get in touch. I mean, there's so many different ways to connect. I have a Substack that I'm sharing regular content, so I would encourage people to engage around that. I'm interested in getting more involved in impact investing. Happy to talk more about some of our work with Lightpost. Wanting to go deeper on the facilitation and engagement side. Happy to talk more on the impact experience side of things. And just generally, I'm always interested in connecting with people that are looking to blend some of these principles and deeper ways of being into our work and lives and expanding the circle of community around that. So really looking forward to that.
One thing that just came into my mind was, I wonder, do you have a basement?
You want to come stay?
I mean, I was just thinking, what a fantastic thing to carry forward. This, this sort of experience. What a wonderful thing. So maybe think about it.
No, I love that.
There's a basement program.
Yeah. It is. I often think about this question of how can I mentor others in the way that I have been mentored? Because I think that there's so much in the basement being a huge part of that, but also all the other ways in which that support has taken place. And it's been such a huge part of the journey. And so what does it look to really pay that forward in physical locations and also just in time and energy?
Jenna, you're a rock star. I'm so grateful to have you here today on Getting Rich Together. Thank you for sharing your spirit, your experiences, your vision, and for being a good human. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you for all you're bringing into the world. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. This is the conversation we come back to every single week. Real women, real wealth, and what becomes possible when we stop being silent about money. If today's episode moved you, don't let it stop here. Wealth Catalyst is where women go to take it further. Our Freedom Tour salons are gathering women in 32 cities this year. Intimate evenings in homes and private spaces where women talk honestly about money, risk, and what they're building. And if you're ready to go even bigger, join us at the Wealth Catalyst Summit, a full-day event in San Francisco this October. Find your city and claim your seat at wealthcatalyst.com. We'll see you there.